In American politics, drama is usually loud, theatrical, and fleeting. But every so often, something quiet happens that is far more consequential. A judge signs a document, a clerk stamps a file, and suddenly the machinery of the law, slow, methodical, indifferent to celebrity, begins to turn. That is what happened 1 minute ago. Not a rally, not a tweet, not a speech, but a legal decision that carries real weight. A federal judge rejecting Donald Trump's claims and allowing the first formal steps toward asset seizure to proceed. This is not a political moment. It is a constitutional one. It is the moment where influence meets accountability, where status meets statute, and where the carefully constructed image of power encounters the unromantic language of the law. What matters here is not who Donald Trump is, but what the legal system is becoming willing to do. Because when the courts stop deferring to political gravity, they reveal something fundamental, in a republic even. The loudest figures are still subject to quiet institutions. And today, the institution spoke. American public life has become a theater that never closes. It rewards volume over reflection, speed over substance, reaction over reason. Every hour brings a new declaration, a new outrage, a new performance calibrated for instant attention and rapid forgetting. Politics has become less a process than a spectacle, a permanent campaign in which the loudest voice is mistaken for the most authoritative one. In such a climate, visibility replaces legitimacy, and repetition begins to masquerade as truth. But the law does not operate on applause. It is not moved by crowds, algorithms, or the emotional rhythms of the moment. It moves on paper, in chambers, through procedure, precedent, and patience. It advances not because it is urgent, but because it is obligated. Its power lies precisely in its indifference to urgency. It does not perform, it proceeds. The contrast between spectacle and gravity is not merely stylistic. It is structural. Spectacle seeks to dominate attention. Gravity seeks to discipline behavior. One expands outward, feeding on reaction and affirmation. The other contracts inward, narrowing choices until only compliance remains. One is nourished by noise. The other is strengthened by silence. And in a society increasingly organized around the first, the appearance of the second feels almost unnatural, even unsettling. There is a temptation to interpret legal action through the language of politics, as victory or defeat, triumph or humiliation, momentum or collapse. But this translation is misleading. The law does not compete, it compels. It does not persuade, it binds. It is not an argument seeking agreement, but a framework demanding adherence. When it acts, it is not expressing an opinion about power. It is defining the boundary of power. This boundary is what makes constitutional systems durable, not the charisma of leaders or the enthusiasm of follower, but the persistence of limits that remain when enthusiasm fades and charisma expires. The legal order exists precisely to survive personalities. It is a mechanism designed to be unimpressed, to remember yesterday when everyone else has already moved on, to insist on continuity in a culture addicted to novelty. The spectacle thrives on immediacy. It needs constant motion to survive. It is impatient, perpetually hungry for the next moment of attention. Gravity, by contrast, is cumulative. It does not surge, it settles. It accumulates slowly, quietly, until resistance becomes exhaustion and defiance becomes compliance. It does not rush to confront power. It waits until power has nowhere left to stand. This is why moments of legal seriousness feel so jarring in modern public life. They interrupt the rhythm of outrage with the tempo of obligation. They replace the language of identity with the language of responsibility, the vocabulary of allegiance with the grammar of accountability. They remind a society trained to see everything as performance that not everything is a performance. And when gravity enters a space dominated by spectacle, The effect is not explosive, but clarifying. It strips away decoration. It removes choice from what had been framed as preference. It reveals the difference between influence and authority, between being seen and being bound, between commanding attention and commanding obedience. In that difference lies the real story, not in the noise that surrounds it, but in the structure it exposes, not in who is speaking, but in what is being enforced, not in how loudly a system is challenged, but in how quietly it continues to function. Authority is most convincing when it does not announce itself. The institutions that endure are not the ones that shout their relevance, but the ones that demonstrate through repetition, restraint, and consistency. Their legitimacy is not borrowed from popularity, nor from approval ratings, nor from the emotional climate of the day. It is accumulated slowly, over decades of unremarkable decisions, uncelebrated rulings, and ordinary acts of enforcement that together form something extraordinary reliability. In a culture accustomed to spectacle, this kind of authority can feel invisible. It does not inspire devotion. It does not invite applause. It does not generate loyalty. It asks only for our recognition and compliance. Its language is procedural. Its rituals are formal, and its tone is deliberately impersonal. It speaks not in slogans but in citations, not in declarations but in determinations. It is designed this way because personality is volatile, and authority cannot afford volatility. The power of a judicial system lies not in its capacity to punish, but in its capacity to be predictable. Predictability creates trust. Trust creates order. And order creates the conditions under which freedom can exist without collapsing into chaos or hardening into coercion. The paradox of institutional authority is that it limits in order to liberate, restrains in order to stabilize, and constrains in order to protect. This is why the most consequential assertions of authority are often the least dramatic. They arrive without ceremony, without commentary, without celebration. A decision is rendered. A motion is denied. A process begins. There is no crowd, no anthem, no spectacle. And yet the effect is profound, because something has shifted from possibility to obligation, from debate to determination, from argument to action. Such moments reveal the difference between influence and authority. Influence persuades, authority binds. Influence is optional, authority is unavoidable. Influence depends on acceptance, authority depends on legitimacy. Influence can be ignored, authority can only be resisted, and resistance carries consequences. This is the distinction that sustains constitutional order, the separation between what can be argued about and what must be complied with. When institutions assert themselves in this way, they are not challenging power, they are defining it. They are not competing with political forces, they are enclosing them. They are not reacting to events, they are absorbing them into a framework that outlives any single moment or movement. They transform volatility into procedure, urgency into sequence, and conflict into record. This transformation is what prevents societies from being ruled by whoever is loudest, fastest, or most emotionally compelling. It replaces the rule of immediacy with the rule of continuity, the rule of personality with the rule of process, the rule of impulse with the rule of precedent. It is slow by design, not because it is inefficient, but because it is cautious about power. Caution is the moral posture of serious institutions. It is the recognition that power, once unleashed, rarely restrains itself, and therefore must be restrained before it acts rather than after it has acted too far. It is the understanding that the greatest abuses are not born from malice, but from momentum, not from evil intentions, but from unexamined certainty. In this sense, the quiet assertion of authority is not an interruption of democracy, but its maintenance. It is the mechanism by which passion is filtered through principle, by which conflict is processed through structure, by which disagreement is contained within rules that make disagreement survivable. It is not the noise of institutions that preserves a republic, but their patience, not their visibility, but their reliability, not their rhetoric, but their restraint. Power is most persuasive when it feels personal. It wraps itself in familiarity, in identity, in story. It convinces not by command, but by connection, not by force, but by resonance. It becomes less something one obeys and more something one belongs to. In that transformation, power becomes intimate, and intimacy makes it harder to question, harder to resist, harder even to see procedure. E is the opposite. It is intentionally impersonal. It does not know names, faces, histories, or emotions. It knows only steps, standards, thresholds, and sequences. It is indifferent to narrative and immune to charisma. It is designed not to feel fair, but to be fair, and to be fair in the same way every time, regardless of who stands before it. The collision between these two forces is inevitable. In any system that values both freedom and order, personal power expands outward, seeking affirmation and alignment. Procedural power moves inward, narrowing discretion and channeling action into prescribed forms. One thrives on flexibility, the other on constraint. One multiplies options, the other reduces them. One asks to be followed, the other requires to be obeyed. This collision is not violent, but it is decisive. It is the moment when persuasion reaches its limit and obligation begins. It is where rhetoric meets requirement, where performance meets paperwork, where influence encounters enforcement. It is not a battle of ideas, but a test of boundaries, a measurement of how far personality can travel before it is absorbed by structure. The modern world is saturated with personal power. Platforms reward presence, audiences reward visibility, movements reward emotion. This creates the illusion that power is something generated from below, from attention, from loyalty, from belonging. But procedural power is generated from elsewhere. It is not accumulated, it is assigned. It does not grow, it exists. It does not compete, it constrains. This is why procedural moments feel deflating to those who have mastered personal power. They do not offer the familiar feedback of approval or rejection. They do not respond to argument with argument, nor to passion with passion. They respond only with compliance or consequence. They do not negotiate identity, they apply standards, and yet this very impersonality is what makes them essential. Without it, every conflict becomes a company. And test of intensity, every disagreement a struggle for dominance, every decision a reflection of who is louder rather than who is right. Procedure prevents societies from becoming arenas where only the strongest voices survive. It creates spaces where strength is irrelevant and only alignment with rules matters. In that sense, procedure is not cold. It is humane in a different way. It protects not by empathy, but by equality, not by understanding, but by uniformity. It refuses to tailor itself to individual stories because it exists to serve all stories, even the ones that are inconvenient, unpopular, or uncomfortable. The collision between personal power and procedural order is therefore not a failure of the system, but its proof. It demonstrates that there are forces in public life that do not bend to mood, that do not adjust to momentum, that do not recalibrate themselves according to applause. It reveals that there is a floor beneath politics, a structure beneath performance, a framework beneath feeling. When that framework asserts itself, it does not announce a victor. It announces a limit. It does not elevate one force over another. It reminds both of where they must stop. It in that stopping point that freedom is preserved, not because power disappears there, but because it is finally shaped into something that can be lived with, shared, and survived. Influence is elastic. It stretches across conversations, across screens, across loyalties and expectations. It can grow rapidly and fade just as quickly. It is sensitive to mood, dependent on context, and vulnerable to fatigue. It thrives in moments of alignment and weakens in moments of doubt. It is always provisional, always contingent, always one misstep away from reversal. Institutions are not elastic. They are rigid by design. Their strength does not come from their ability to expand, but from their refusal to bend. They exist to be stable in an unstable world, to be consistent in a culture that rewards change, to be predictable in a society that increasingly celebrates disruption. Their authority is not persuasive, but positional. It does not seek agreement, it asks. Jurisdiction. The limit of personal influence appears when it encounters something that does not respond to it. A structure that does not listen, a rule that does not care, a sequence that cannot be rearranged. This encounter feels frustrating, even unjust, to those accustomed to shaping outcomes through presence and persuasion. It feels like an interruption of agency, a denial of individual id, a reduction of complexity into form. But this reduction is the very mechanism that makes collective life possible. Without limits, influence becomes domination. Without structure, persuasion becomes coercion. Without rules, every negotiation becomes a power struggle. And every power struggle ends not with resolution, but with exhaustion. Institutions exist to prevent that exhaustion from becoming the governing principle of society. They do this by converting personal will into procedural pathways, by translating desire into documentation, by transforming intention into compliance. They take what is fluid and render it fixed, what is emotional and render it formal, what is impulsive and render it sequential. In doing so, they slow life down not to frustrate it, but to make it navigable. The limit imposed by institutions is not a punishment, but a boundary. It is not meant to diminish individuals, but to protect them from one another. It ensures that no single will can overwhelm the space in which all wills must coexist. It creates a geometry of restraint in which freedom does not collapse under its own weight. This geometry is invisible most of the time. It is noticed only way. It resists when it refuses, when it obstructs. Its normal functioning is quiet. It is experienced not as presence, but as absence. The absence of chaos, the absence of arbitrariness, the absence of fear that tomorrow will be ruled by a different impulse than today. When personal influence meets institutional limit, something important is revealed. Not that influence is illegitimate, but that IT is insufficient. Not that institutions are hostile to freedom, but that they are the conditions of it. They do not exist to suppress agency, but to distribute it, to ensure that agency is not monopolized by those with the greatest reach or the loudest voice. This encounter often feels like loss because it is the loss of control, the loss of immediacy, the loss of narrative dominance. But it is also the gain of stability, the gain of predictability, the gain of a shared framework within which disagreement can occur without destruction. A society without institutional limits becomes a contest without rules, a conversation without grammar, a game without boundaries. Everything becomes possible, and therefore nothing becomes secure. In such a society, freedom exists only for the strong, the fast, and the relentless. The limit is what makes freedom common rather than exclusive, durable rather than momentary, survivable rather than spectacular. It is not the expansion of influence that preserves a system, but the acceptance of its limits, not the triumph of any one will, but the persistence of a structure that outlasts them all, Reconectar contigo no es volver a quien eras antes de las heridas. Es conocerte desde un lugar más real. Durante mucho tiempo viviste desconectado de tus necesidades, de tus límites, de tu ritmo interno. Hiciste lo que se esperaba, cumpliste lo que tocaba, avanzaste como pudiste. Pero sanar implica detenerse y preguntarse con honestidad qué necesitas ahora. No desde la exigencia, sino desde la escucha. Cuando dejas de exigirte, algo se relaja profundamente. La mente deja de empujarte, el cuerpo empieza a confiar, las emociones encuentran espacio, no porque desaparezcan los problemas, sino porque ya no te enfrentas a ellos desde la dureza. Empiezas a tratarte como tratarías a alguien a quien amas con paciencia, con respeto, con cuidado. Y ese cambio interno es más poderoso que cualquier técnica o respuesta externa, pero reconectar contigo también significa reconciliarte con tus límites. Aceptar que no puedes con todo, que no tienes que poder siempre, que descansar no es fallar. En una cultura que glorifica el esfuerzo constante, escucharte se vuelve un acto revolucionario. Decir basta cuando es necesario. Decir no cuando algo te sobrepasa. Permitir que el cansancio sea una señal, no un enemigo. Porque solo cuando respetas tus límites puedes habitarte sin violencia. Sanar no te convierte en alguien perfecto, te convierte en alguien presente. Presente para sentir, para elegir, para equivocarte sin destruirte. Empiezas a tomar decisiones más alineadas con lo que te nutre y menos con lo que te desgasta. Ya no vives para cumplir una imagen, vives para sostener una coherencia interna. Y esa coherencia genera una paz silenciosa que no depende de que todo esté bien afuera. Cuando te reconectas contigo, la vida se vuelve más simple, no más fácil, pero más honesta. Ya no necesitas huir del dolor ni forzarte a estar bien. Puedes estar como estás y desde ahí moverte. La sanación deja de ser un objetivo y se vuelve una consecuencia natural de cómo te relacionas contigo cada día. Porque al dejar de exigirte, al dejar de empujarte, al dejar de ser fuerte a la fuerza, te das el permiso que siempre necesitaste, ser tú, completo, incluso con lo que duele,